When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the German High Command regarded Soviet leadership as deeply flawed. Years of political purges ordered by Joseph Stalin had removed much of the Red Army's experienced officer corps, leaving behind a command structure the Germans believed to be rigid, fearful, and incompetent. Early victories only reinforced this belief. Yet as the war continued, one Soviet commander began to stand apart from the rest, an officer whose presence on the battlefield would soon command both fear and reluctant respect from Germany's finest generals. If you enjoy listening to documentaries and war history, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Also turn on your notification bell so you don't miss out on any new post. That man was Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov would emerge as one of the greatest military tacticians the Soviet Union ever produced. Through innovation, discipline, and an exceptional understanding of operational warfare, he would crush Japanese forces in the east, halt the German blitzkrieg outside Moscow, and ensure that the Soviet Union not only survived its darkest hour, but eventually rose as one of the world's dominant superpowers. What truly set Zhukov apart was not ideology or political loyalty, but his ability to see warfare as a system, where logistics, timing, deception, and concentration of force mattered more than slogans or blind aggression. In this documentary, we will examine Zhukov's most legendary tactical maneuvers, decisive operations that reshaped the course of the Second World War and cemented his reputation as arguably the single greatest battlefield commander of the conflict. Khalkhin Gol, the Eastern Test, 1939. In 1939, just months before war erupted in Europe, tensions were already escalating far to the east. Along the remote frontier between the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo and the Soviet-aligned state of Mongolia, a bitter dispute simmered over the true location of the border. The Japanese insisted it ran along the Khalkhin Gol River, while the Soviets and Mongolians maintained that the frontier lay nearly 16 kilometers east of the river itself. What began as patrol clashes soon grew into a dangerous series of skirmishes. By the summer of 1939, the open steppe between Mongolia and Manchukuo had become a volatile flashpoint. Both sides rushed troops, armor, and artillery into the region, each expecting a limited border confrontation, but preparing, unknowingly, for something far more decisive. On the 1st of June 1939, Georgy Zhukov was summoned to Moscow. Given the atmosphere of paranoia surrounding Stalin's purges, Zhukov feared the worst. Many capable officers had vanished into NKVD prisons, never to return. But instead of arrest, Zhukov was given command of the 1st Army Group at Khalkhin Gol, with a single, uncompromising mission: end the Japanese threat once and for all. Zhukov arrived at the front on June 5, surveying the terrain, vast, flat, treeless steppes stretching in every direction. He immediately recognized an opportunity. This was not a battlefield for slow, infantry-heavy advances. It was ground built for speed, maneuver, and firepower. He began assembling a force unlike anything the Japanese had faced. Motorized infantry brigades were rushed forward. Aircraft were concentrated in unprecedented numbers. Fast-moving BT tanks were brought in by the hundreds. Zhukov believed that on open terrain, tanks should not merely support infantry, but operate as independent strike forces, free to maneuver rapidly, penetrate deep, and shatter the enemy's rear before a response could form. This approach marked a sharp departure from traditional Soviet doctrine and caught the Japanese completely unprepared. After weeks of probing attacks and localized clashes, the front settled into a tense stalemate by late July. But Zhukov had no intention of remaining locked in place. Behind the scenes, preparations for a decisive blow were already underway. In the days leading up to the offensive, Zhukov executed a masterful deception. Under the cover of darkness, Soviet units were quietly repositioned into attack formations. To mask the sound of tank engines, supply trucks had their mufflers removed and were driven deliberately in front of armored columns during the night. The steppe thundered with noise, confusing Japanese patrols who struggled to determine the size, composition, or direction of the Soviet buildup. Night after night, the illusion grew. Then, at dawn on August 20, 1939, the Mongolian steppe erupted. A massive artillery barrage shattered Japanese positions, followed by the sudden appearance of over 550 Soviet aircraft, the first large-scale fighter-bomber offensive in Red Air Force history. The Japanese front line was smashed before many units could even comprehend what was unfolding. Moments later, more than 50,000 Soviet and Mongolian troops surged forward against the Japanese center. Believing this to be the main attack, Japanese commanders rushed forces in from both flanks to stabilize the line. It was exactly the response Zhukov had anticipated. As Japanese forces poured into the center to blunt the Soviet assault, they unknowingly exposed their flanks. Zhukov had designed the battle precisely for this moment. While the enemy focused forward, powerful armored formations were already in motion beyond their field of vision. From the north and south, Soviet tank brigades surged outward in wide arcs across the open steppe. The 4th, 6th, and 11th Tank Brigades drove forward at full speed, bypassing resistance and pushing deep into Japanese rear areas. Supply roads were seized. Communication was as soon as they were discovered. The speed and coordination of the maneuver left Japanese commanders struggling to issue coherent orders as their entire operational structure began to collapse. By August 25, the two Soviet armored wings linked up near Nomonhan, sealing the encirclement. The Japanese 23rd Division, the elite corps of the Japanese 6th Army in the region, found itself completely surrounded on open ground, with no natural cover and no viable route of withdrawal. The Japanese had made two fatal miscalculations. First, they had severely underestimated Zhukov's logistical ability to mass armor and aircraft at such distance from his supply bases. Second, they had been entirely deceived about the true location of his armored units, believing them to be positioned defensively rather than poised for deep offensive maneuver. A desperate breakout attempt was launched, but it was swiftly crushed by prepared Soviet fortifications and overwhelming firepower. Refusing to surrender, Japanese units fought to the end. Soviet artillery and aircraft methodically pulverized the trapped force, reducing the pocket to complete destruction. The result was absolute. An entire Japanese division had been annihilated. The defeat sent shockwaves through Tokyo. Japan would never again risk a northern war against the Soviet Union. Instead, its strategic focus shifted southward, toward the Pacific, and ultimately toward conflict with the United States. For Zhukov, Khalkhin Gol was more than a victory. It was proof that modern warfare belonged to speed, coordination, deception, and concentrated armored force. His innovative use of armored spearheads, combined with an exceptional grasp of logistics and operational timing, earned him immediate recognition from the Soviet High Command. That recognition would soon place him at the center of the greatest and most brutal war in human history. Moscow, the defense of a capital, 1941. By the autumn of 1941, the Soviet Union stood on the brink of collapse. In just 4 months, Operation Barbarossa had torn through thousands of kilometers of Soviet territory. Entire Red Army formations had been destroyed. Millions of soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. With German forces advancing at unprecedented speed, the Wehrmacht now turned its full attention toward Moscow. On October 2, 1941, Germany launched Operation Typhoon, a massive offensive aimed at capturing the Soviet capital. Nearly 1 million German soldiers and 1,700 tanks drove eastward in a relentless push. Soviet defenses at Bryansk and Vyazma were smashed aside, resulting in the encirclement of more than 500,000 Soviet troops, one of the most catastrophic defeats in Red Army history. Moscow now lay virtually defenseless. German propaganda declared Soviet collapse imminent. Soldiers were told they would be home by Christmas. But the situation demanded more than optimism, it demanded leadership. On October 10, Georgy Zhukov was urgently flown in from the defense of Leningrad. He was given a single order: hold Moscow at all costs. The situation could not have been more critical. Yet Zhukov acted without hesitation. One of his first directives was the immediate conversion of Moscow's civilian industry into wartime production. Clock factories were transformed to produce mines. Chocolate factories were repurposed to manufacture canned food. Automobile plants became tank repair workshops. Every available resource was pressed into service. Even civilians were mobilized. Women and teenagers dug anti-tank ditches by hand, moving nearly 3 million cubic meters of earth without mechanical assistance. New Soviet divisions were assembled from scratch, while every available unit was ordered to strengthen the capital's defensive belt. Despite continued losses throughout October, the newly led defenses inflicted mounting casualties on the advancing German forces. By October 31, the Wehrmacht's momentum began to slow, buying Zhukov precious time as winter approached. And Zhukov was preparing something far more decisive. As the German offensive stalled outside Moscow, Zhukov gained the time he needed to reach his through Soviet intelligence and diplomatic channels. Moscow confirmed that Japan would not attack in the east. This single piece of information changed everything. With the eastern border secure, Zhukov immediately ordered the transfer of Siberian and Far Eastern divisions to the Moscow front. These troops were battle-hardened, well-trained, and equipped for extreme winter warfare. They were accustomed to fighting in temperatures that crippled German engines and froze lubricants solid. Zhukov placed them carefully at critical sectors along the defensive line, holding them back until the moment was right. On November 15, 1941, the Wehrmacht launched what it hoped would be the final blow. The offensive took the form of a massive pincer attack, designed to encircle Moscow and link up near the city of Noginsk. In the north, German tank armies advanced successfully toward Klin, threatening to break through. In the south, however, the attack met fierce resistance from fresh Soviet formations that Zhukov had deliberately positioned for maximum effect. The fighting was brutal and unrelenting. German units pressed forward regardless of casualties. Zhukov later recalled in his memoirs, "The enemy, ignoring losses, made frontal assaults, striving to reach Moscow by any means necessary." The desperation was real. German forces were critically short of winter clothing and shelter. Reports recorded over 100,000 cases of frostbite, with temperatures plunging to -45°C by the end of November. General Guderian himself reported that engines froze solid and weapons failed under the cold. Yet despite these conditions, the German advance continued, until it ran headlong into Zhukov's carefully constructed multi-layered defense. Soviet losses were minimized, while German units were ground down by overlapping fields of fire, counterattacks, and fortified positions placed exactly where they would do the most damage. As the southern pincer approached the town of Kashira, Zhukov struck back. He unleashed a powerful counterattack built around newly assembled formations equipped with SVT-40 semi-automatic rifles, factory-fresh KV-1 heavy tanks, and T-34 medium tanks. The counterblow was violent and decisive. For the first time in the war, the armored spearhead of Heinz Guderian was driven backward, forced to retreat more than 40 kilometers to the town of Msensk. The German advance on Moscow had been stopped. With the enemy exhausted, overextended, and freezing in place, Zhukov seized the moment. On December 5, 1941, he launched the first major Soviet counteroffensive of the war. More than 1 million Soviet troops and over 1,700 tanks surged forward along a front stretching nearly 1,000 kilometers. Siberian ski units swept around German flanks, striking supply lines and forcing chaotic withdrawals. By early January, the Wehrmacht had been pushed back as much as 250 kilometers from the capital. Moscow was saved. The German dream of capturing the Soviet capital and ending the war before winter had collapsed. Zhukov had once again demonstrated his mastery of logistics, defensive layering, and his rare ability to anticipate enemy intentions. Across the Soviet Union, he was hailed as a hero. But the war was far from over, and Germany's most dangerous offensive still lay ahead. Despite the failure at Moscow, Adolf Hitler refused to abandon the Eastern Campaign. In 1942, German strategy shifted south, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial heart of the Volga River basin. At the center of this new offensive stood one city, Stalingrad. For Hitler, Stalingrad was more than a strategic objective. It carried symbolic weight, bearing the name of his greatest ideological enemy. Capturing it would sever Soviet transport along the Volga, cripple industrial production, and deliver a psychological blow the Soviet leadership might never recover from. Beginning in the late summer of 1942, the German Sixth Army, supported by elements of the 4th Panzer Army, advanced toward the city. What followed was one of the most devastating bombing campaigns of the war. Luftwaffe aircraft dropped nearly 1,000 tons of bombs per day, reducing entire districts to rubble. Fires raged uncontrollably, and tens of thousands of civilians were killed or buried beneath collapsing buildings. Yet the destruction failed to achieve its intended effect. Instead of open ground, the bombing transformed Stalingrad into a landscape of shattered concrete and twisted steel, terrain perfectly suited for defense. Soviet troops clung to ruins, factories, and cellars, fighting at distances measured in meters. German soldiers would later describe the city as a furnace, where survival from one hour to the next was never guaranteed. One German officer wrote, "Stalingrad is not a city anymore. It is an enormous cloud of burning smoke by day and a blinding chaos of fire by night." As the fighting intensified, entire divisions were consumed in relentless, close-quarters combat. Casualties mounted at a staggering rate. Yet even as the Germans poured men into the city, Zhukov was already planning something far larger than a defensive stand. Alongside Alexander Vasilevsky, Zhukov identified a critical weakness in the German deployment. While elite units fought street by street inside Stalingrad, the flanks of the German Sixth Army were held by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian formations. These Allied troops were poorly equipped, lacked effective anti-tank weapons, and were spread thin across vast stretches of open steppe. Zhukov saw an opportunity strikingly familiar. Just as at Khalkhin Gol years earlier, the enemy's attention was fixed forward, blind to the danger forming on both sides. Throughout the autumn, Zhukov orchestrated a massive deception campaign known as Maskirovka. Soviet troop movements were concealed, dummy formations were constructed, and radio traffic was deliberately manipulated to suggest defensive intentions. German reconnaissance aircraft failed to detect the buildup, convinced that the Red Army was too exhausted to mount a large-scale offensive. In reality, Zhukov was quietly assembling more than 1 million troops, thousands of artillery pieces, and powerful armored formations on both sides of Stalingrad. The plan was simple in concept, and devastating in execution. Rather than strike the heavily fortified city center, Soviet forces would smash through the weakly defended flanks, encircle the Sixth Army, and seal it inside Stalingrad. Once trapped, the Germans would be destroyed not by frontal assault, but by isolation, starvation, and relentless pressure. By mid-November 1942, the trap was ready. All that remained was to close it. At dawn on November 19, 1942, Zhukov set his plan in motion. Under a curtain of fog and snow, thousands of Soviet artillery pieces opened fire across the northern flank of the German Sixth Army. The bombardment was overwhelming. Romanian positions collapsed almost immediately, their defenses shattered by concentrated shelling and massed armor. Within hours, Soviet tank corps were pouring through the gaps, advancing at full speed across the frozen steppe. The following day, November 20th, a second Soviet assault struck from the south. Once again, Axis defenses buckled. German attempts to rush reinforcements forward came too late. The Red Army's armored spearheads drove deep into the enemy rear, severing supply routes and destroying command centers with ruthless efficiency. On November 23rd, Soviet forces from the north and south linked up near the town of Kalakondon. The encirclement was complete. More than 250,000 German and Axis troops were now trapped inside Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army, once considered among the most powerful formations in the Wehrmacht, found itself surrounded, isolated, and cut off from resupply. Hitler refused to allow a breakout. Instead, he ordered the army to hold its ground and promised to not The promise proved catastrophic. Aircraft losses mounted rapidly, while winter weather and Soviet anti-aircraft fire made sustained resupply impossible. German soldiers inside the city soon faced starvation, disease, and freezing temperatures with little hope of relief. Zhukov tightened the noose. Throughout December and January, Soviet forces crushed every German attempt to break the encirclement from the outside. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's relief operation failed under relentless Soviet pressure. Inside the pocket, ammunition dwindled. Fuel ran dry. Wounded soldiers froze to death in ruined buildings that no longer offered shelter. By early January 1943, the end was unavoidable. If you enjoy listening to documentaries and war history, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Also turn on your notification bell so you don't miss out on any new post. On February 2, 1943, the last remnants of the German Sixth Army surrendered. Nearly 91,000 German soldiers, including Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, laid down their arms. Tens of thousands more had already perished in the ruins of the city. Stalingrad marked the most crushing defeat in German military history. For the first time, an entire German field army had been annihilated. From this moment onward, the Wehrmacht would remain largely on the defensive in the east, slowly pushed back toward Germany itself. For Georgy Zhukov, Stalingrad confirmed what Khalkhin Gol and Moscow had already proven. He was a commander who understood modern warfare in its entirety, how to mislead an enemy, how to concentrate overwhelming force, and how to strike not where the enemy was strongest, but where they were fatally exposed. Zhukov's victories were not accidents, nor were they the result of sheer numbers alone. They were the product of planning, patience, and a ruthless clarity of purpose. By the end of the war, his methods would help carry the Red Army all the way to Berlin. This was not merely victory through endurance. It was victory through mastery.